Jesus died on April 3rd, 33 AD. 1,941 years to the day from when my wife Becky was born. You say that's really specific. A group of geologists have taken the biblical record and determined the only seismic event in the region around Jerusalem that at all corresponds to the time of Jesus' death, according to the Bible, occurred on that day. Well, it may or may not be true, but don't be fooled. Don't be fooled into thinking that Jesus did not die as a result of crucifixion. It is one of the most provable facts in human history. In fact, there are not many modern scholars willing to argue that Jesus did not die on a cross. A Swedish theologian, Gunnar Samuelsson, argues that over the past 2,000 years, every theologian and scholar has been mistaken about Jesus' death. Samuelson's doctoral thesis centered on crucifixion in antiquity, and he argues that there are no references to crosses in ancient documents and that even the Bible itself does not refer to crosses or crucifixion. Well, you can get a doctorate for saying that. You're still wrong. The word we've all been translating cross, Samuelsson argues, it's the Greek word staros, means pole, and that it was nothing more than a suspension device. I'm not making this up. Someone actually gave Samuelsson a PhD for his research, as shoddy as it was, and it was really bad. Of course, that didn't stop Good Morning America and ABC News from running the story about 10 years ago, when Samuelsson argued to every American that every translation of staros as cross is wrong. Well, let me tell you, it is true that not every translation of staros is cross, but most of them are translated that way. Samuelsson's work has been reviewed and rebutted, and it was actually quite easy. A guy named John Cook published Crucifixion in the Mediterranean World about 3 years after Samuelsson's research was published. And Cook concludes the idea that staros must be restricted to pole and only refers to Jesus being suspended in the air is absolutely incorrect. Cook cites numerous primary sources. These were the ones Samuelsson was unable to find, apparently, going back as far as the 6th century BC, the earliest days of the Roman Republic. Cook also includes chronological survey of Roman crucifixion from the Second Punic War, which is about the 2nd century BC, through Constantine, 4th century AD, and estimates that the Romans conservatively crucified about 30,000 people. So why is there confusion? Part of it is Samuelsson's desire to be unique, to find a problem that nobody else has ever seen before, and that's sometimes happens in scholarship. Samuelsson should know that while Greek is not particularly precise when it comes to crucifixion, Latin certainly is. Latin was not a dead language at the time of Jesus. Staros can mean pole, but it usually means cross. But Greek doesn't distinguish the crossbeam from the cross itself. You have a crossbeam, you have a cross. And this is likely what Jesus carried, the crossbeam. It's what Latin calls the patibulum. The patibulum is that crossbeam, and Jesus carried this through the streets of Jerusalem toward his death, not the pole itself. Samuelsson may be only professing evangelical to argue that Jesus died on a pole, not on a cross, but he's not alone. Interestingly enough, Muslims agree with Samuelsson that Jesus did not die on a cross. Muslim scholars argue that in Islam, Jesus is a prophet, a very important prophet, but that Muslims, quote, here's the quote, Muslims believe that Allah saved the Messiah from the ignominy of crucifixion, end quote. Another one writes, quote, we honor Jesus more than you Christians do. We refuse to believe that God would permit him to suffer death on a cross, end quote. So Muslims argue that Jesus didn't die on a cross. and that Allah saved Jesus from death, and that it only appeared that he died. So what does the Bible say? How do you believe about the death of Jesus? Did Jesus die by crucifixion? Well, the answer is yes. That's how Jesus died. And not only was Jesus crucified, but he died on that cross. So let's consider number one. Everyone should believe that Jesus was crucified. The historical details of Jesus' execution are substantial. Look at the text. A location is named in verse 33. He was crucified at Golgotha, the place of a skull. Tradition puts this place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, outside of Jerusalem. Gordon's Calvary, a different place, looks more like a skull. We don't know exactly where Jesus died today. It could be one or the other, or a different place entirely. Hebrews says that it was outside the gates of Jerusalem. And it's likely it was on a well-trafficked road or even a crossroad outside of Jerusalem. But the location of his death is named. Number two, the manner of his execution is identified. Crucifixion means that Jesus was fixed to a cross. You know, in John's gospel indicates that Jesus had wounds in his hands and his feet. How did he get those wounds? They're consistent with one being nailed to a cross. And let's be somewhat circumspect here. The Bible never focuses its attention on the physical sufferings of Jesus, and I would say neither should we, but we must know that Jesus was fixed to a cross. And then third, there were witnesses to his execution. There's Simon of Cyrene in verse 32, a visitor to Jerusalem who happens just to be a bystander to this event. Can you imagine? You're there for a feast, for a festival, and you have to watch this bloody, horrible spectacle and even join in your clothes being stained and ruined by the blood of Jesus. Can you imagine being there? And then poor Simon becomes a believer. His sons, Alexander and Rufus, Mark writes in Mark 15, are known to the early church. And so apparently this was a life-changing event for Simon. Of course, the Roman soldiers witnessed his execution. These are the same who mocked Jesus in verses 27 through 31, but they're also the ones after Jesus died who noted, as the centurion said, he is the Son of God. You see in verse 54. There were two criminals there. They were witnesses to Jesus' death. There were bystanders there, verse 39. This is why some think Jesus was crucified in a place where there was a lot of people moving about. It says that, look at verse 39, it says that they that passed by reviled him. The bystanders, people just coming and going. The religious leaders of the Sanhedrin were there. The Sadducees, who made their money selling animals in the temple when the tables were overturned by Jesus just days earlier, they are there. The scribes are there. The elders of Israel are there. All the important people, all those who cried out, let his blood be on us and our children. All of those who called for his crucifixion, they are there. And the Galilean women in Jesus' company are there. It says in verses 55 and 56 that Mary Magdalene, Jesus' mother, James and John's mother, and then of course Salome, that's what Mark adds, and John tells us Mary, the wife of Clopas, was there. So here we have these ladies, these Galilean women who had for years traveled with Jesus and then out of their own pockets had paid for food and shelter for him. They are there. All of these witnesses are there. But that's not the only evidence we have that Jesus was on a cross. Additional information provides verifiable historical context. That's the important word, verifiable. That we have here in the historical method some indication that this is a true historical event. Look at some of the background stories going on. Jesus is given vinegar at the beginning of his death. He refuses it and takes it later. He wouldn't drink the vinegar in verse 34, and it's likely that this is nearly an undrinkable drink. Some people think that there are these women that would go to crucifixions and they would try to help the sufferer by giving him something to dull the pain. That actually didn't help. It prolonged his suffering. It's more likely that the soldiers are the one administering this vinegar to the sufferers to prolong their pain. Soldiers really weren't known for mercy, right? That's just really not who they are as people. But you see, at the end of Jesus's crucifixion, right before he dies, he does take the vinegar in verse 48. He's accomplished already becoming our sin bearer. The darkness of judgment is past, and now he can drink this alcohol to deaden the pain. He drinks a different drink here because he has nothing left to do but die. And then the soldiers, they cast lots for his clothing. You see that in verse 35. Jesus loses his only possessions on earth. Have you ever thought about this? When Jesus said to people to follow him, he said, foxes have their holes and birds have their nests. I have no place to lay my head. And the only possessions he had were the clothes that he wore, the sandals on his feet. That's all Jesus had. And when he died, they took all of his possessions away and they played a game. They threw dice to see who would get his clothing. He dies with nothing left, but what a death as the soldiers watch him and play dice for his clothes. There's an accusation against him displayed on the cross. This is common in Roman judgment, in their Roman justice, to actually have some sort of placard, some sort of statement. Sometimes it was rolled up and placed beside them or even tied to their bodies. With Jesus, it was placed above the cross, above the patibulum, where they actually had the crossbeam, and they nailed to the cross the statement, "Here's Jesus, King of the Jews." They say that is what he did in violation against Rome, and that's why he's dying. But his accusation is there. And then I love this. The veracity of his previous statements are held against him. Do you notice in verse 40 what he's being accused of? And you remember back during his trial, this was part of the accusation against Jesus. During his trial, people said that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. You remember that. And then there's some question. Of course, they didn't understand him. He's talking about his body, and they didn't fully understand, but I think they did kind of understand. His promise to rebuild the temple is mocked in verse 40. You that destroys the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. But notice in verse 42, as authority of Israel, his kingship is being challenged. If he saved others, if he be the king of Israel, come down from the cross, we will believe him. And his cry to the Father is misunderstood. In verse 47 to 49, some of them said, he's crying to Elias. Let Elias come and save him, verse 49. But isn't it interesting when you get later, and we'll notice this in just a few minutes, when you get later to the story of Jesus' burial, the Pharisees, or rather the leaders of Israel, the Pharisees and the chief priests, come and say, we know what he said while he was alive, that he would die in 3 days, he'd rise again. And so truly, I think they kind of understood what Jesus was talking about. And here, at the time when all of this is going on, the entire region shakes as the power of God is on display. And in the Old Testament, the earthquake is a symbol of God's might. Jesus is dying on a cross. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to nail this down in your mind. Lock it down. Jesus died on a cross. He was crucified. And this brings us to the second point. If everyone should believe that he was crucified, then everyone should believe that he died there. that the crucifixion resulted in his death. And there is historical evidence that Jesus died. There are natural phenomena that occur. A natural darkness from 12 to 3. What's the result of this? Nobody really knows. This is the time of judgment against sin. In the Old Testament, darkness is judgment against sin. And it's over the land of Israel, likely Jerusalem and its precincts. And if you go back to the Old Testament, Amos chapter 8, for example, you see darkness as being sign and a symbol of God's judging sin. And it's there during that time, those 3 hours, that Jesus is hanging alone on a cross. It's there that the sins of man and the judgment of God are coming together, and God is pouring out his wrath on Jesus, the sin bearer. And he is being crushed by the wrath of God for sin. And God hides his servant, the Messiah, on the cross because of this darkness. And Jesus cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's hard to really understand what he means by that. Some people think, as Luther did, that this is Jesus as part of the Trinity, saying that the Father had forsaken him. I've held that view before. I actually think what Jesus is doing is drawing our attention to Psalm 22, where those words are given. And if you read that psalm, it does begin with a lament, but it ends with a glorious exultation. Because Jesus then, he commends his spirit to the Father and he dies. And so I don't know that Jesus is actually crying out in pain here or suffering. It makes me wonder if he's just now, after having borne the sins of man and triumphing over sin, is calling out triumph. Certainly when he says it is finished, it's a call of triumph. And the earth shakes. And some pretty remarkable things happen. The veil of the temple is torn into 2 pieces. Isn't that interesting? This is a fact that could have been easily proven or disproven. Somebody had to sew that tent back together. Somebody had to get out their needle and thread and say, this we can't have this. We can't have a temple, the holiest of holies, that the place where you enter, the inner sanctum of the temple, that veil that would be between the people and the high priest, as he would go in with the blood of the lamb and offer it there on the altar, on the mercy seat, and he would sprinkle it with the blood of that lamb, and he would make atonement for sin. Jesus, Hebrews tells us, went into the holy place in heaven, the real holy place, of which the one on earth was just a shadow, was just a symbol. He went into the real place, but with his own blood. And he offered there true atonement and covered that mercy seat so that all of us who stand before God, we don't stand in our own righteousness, but in the righteousness of Jesus. That's what happened. And so there's no need for veil anymore. You're saying today you could walk into the holiest place, no fear of death? Yeah, I could grab hold of the Ark of the Covenant and give it a good shake. I absolutely believe that. Wait a minute, no, that can't be. Well, sure it is. Do you realize, Paul says, your body is the naos, it is the holy place of the Spirit. Where the Spirit dwells is the holy place. And we have him with us all the time. I have no trouble believing that. The separation between God and man had ended. There's a lot of difference before the cross and after the cross, isn't there? There's spiritual significance to this truth because the great high priest, once for all, offered his own blood for us. And then it says the earthquake was so violent that it opened the graves of people who had died and been buried in Jerusalem. It's a little interlude here. It says after Jesus' resurrection. You know this? Did you notice that? It's not now, but within 3 days. Actually, when Jesus rises from the dead, he's not the only one who's going to rise. Some of these Old Testament saints are going to rise too, some of the ones around Jerusalem. And they're actually going to go into the city. And not only Jesus is going to be seen by others, but Matthew says some of these Old Testament saints are going to be seen by others. It's a weird story. It's the only place in the Gospels where you find the story, but it all happens at the resurrection of Jesus. but their graves are opened by the earthquake. So you have the veil of the temple being torn and the graves being opened. Matthew states clearly in verse 50 that Jesus dies. There was a theory that came from Christian liberalism. I guess we should put Christian in air quotes because these people were not Christians. That Jesus did not die on a cross, but that he merely swooned and later revived. That is, he was near death, he was close to death, he was about to die, but then he didn't die, but that he later revived. If you look at Matthew's text, it's clear what he says. Jesus gave up his spirit. Let me tell you what that means. To us, we just say, okay, he had a spirit, we have a soul spirit, he gave that up, so he died. But to the Jew, this is significant because when the spirit leaves the body, as a Jewish man reading this text, or as Matthew as a Jewish man writing this text, he's making it crystal clear. You need to understand, when the spirit leaves the body, death has occurred. Because Jewish mystics thought the spirit could leave and maybe come back. But no, the body and the spirit were separated. Jesus' spirit had left his body. He had gone to be with his Father to offer atonement for our sin. And Jesus died. The soldiers are witnesses to his death, verse 54. They call him, surely he's the Son of God, the very thing they're mocking him about in verse 40. If you be the Son of God, come down from the cross. That's the elders and the priests. They're making fun of Jesus, the scribes, all those who were his opponents. And here he is later. It's the centurion. It's that Roman, ugly, horrible, hateful man who has crucified Jesus and put him to such grief. He is now the one saying, truly this was the Son of God. And all the soldiers there are in agreement. They had heard the mockery of the priests and scribes, and they said, wait a minute, you guys have it wrong. It really is the Son of God who's died on this cross. Verse 58, Pilate, the Roman governor, is informed of his death. In Mark's gospel, it tells us that Pilate is surprised that Jesus had already died. He's dead already? And the full weight of Roman law had come down on Jesus. Do you realize something? Crucifixion was not a sentence that ended in anything other than death. If Rome said you're going to die, Rome made it sure that you died. In all of human history, there's only one example of a man who lived after crucifixion. He lived for a short time, a few hours, and then he died. His friends had been able to take him off the cross early, but he still didn't survive. People died on a cross. Then we have a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin preparing his body for burial. You see that in verse 57 through 59. Joseph, he's a respected member of Jewish leadership. By the way, he's part of this group that's making fun of Jesus, but he's not there because he was one of the few in opposition to Jesus' death. He's a secret disciple, along with Nicodemus, John tells us later. He came, and both of them claimed the body for burial, and with Nicodemus, they wrapped Jesus' body in cloth that had been soaked in spices, many pounds of spices, John indicates, and they wrapped Jesus' body in this cloth and in these spices, a customary thing for Jews to do at the time. And then notice in verse 60, he was placed into a cave, into a secured tomb that had been carved out of pure rock. This is permanent. A stone had been rolled in front of the cave to keep people out, very permanent. And of course, the women now in verse 61 are witnesses to this event. This is how they know where to go on Sunday morning, early in the morning. And then to be clear, the Jewish leaders were convinced that he had died. Both the religious parties in Israel were satisfied and were in agreement that Jesus had died on that cross. In verse 62, the next day that followed the day of preparation, the priests come to Pilate and they say, we know he said he would rise again, so let's make sure he's dead. Isn't it interesting? They're more aware of what Jesus said than the disciples themselves. And at least they believed that Jesus had said it. And they considered it to be not possible, but they didn't want it to happen, so we got to make sure. and a watch was set at the door of his tomb to protect it against those who would rob the grave, in verse 66. Jesus was crucified, and he died on that cross. And men and women, this is one of the most provable events in all of human history. You can stand before people, and without fear and without shame, you can tell them, you may not agree with my faith. You may not agree with the Bible, but I'm telling you, this is absolutely a fact. Jesus died on a cross. Now, what does that mean to you? What do you take away from that? He died on a cross for our sins. This is what we had read to us earlier today. This is part of the saving aspect of the gospel. He died for our sins. He suffered there in my place, in your place. And as you reflect upon this truth, the reality that Jesus died on a cross, let it be crystal clear in your mind that he died there because someone, only he, could pay the perfect penalty against our sin. And so he dies. In 1857, there were some archaeologists working around Rome. They came upon an imperial palace on Palatine Hill. It's old. It goes back to somewhere between the 1st and the 3rd century AD. This is the height of the Roman Empire. This is after Nero, but it's around the time of Domitian. You understand Domitian hated Christianity. Domitian is one who had authorized Christians to be tortured and murdered in different parts. It was localized persecution, but it was under Domitian that many of those horrible things you read in Fox's Book of Martyrs took place. Domitian hated Christianity, and his architect, Raburius, it's kind of a weird name, Raburius, actually had built this palace for him on Palatine Hill. Well, in 1857, when they uncovered this palace, they found on the wall, on one of its walls, a very crude drawing. It's 33 centimeters by 38 centimeters, so it's small. It looks like somebody took a rock or maybe a crude piece of metal, and they just kind of made this picture on the wall. It's called Alexamenos' Graffito. You've seen a picture of it. Some of you have. It's a crude drawing of a human body with a donkey's head, and the body is on a T-shaped cross. Get a picture. There's a man standing there. He's got his hand raised up before this donkey-headed man. Obviously, it's an insult, right? You put the head of a donkey on a man, you're insulting him. And there's the donkey's head, and there's the cross, and the donkey's arms are stretched out, and then the body of a man. And the man stands before that donkey-headed figure on a cross, and he has his own hand raised up. And that's the drawing. And then it has this statement. It's in Latin. I'll read to you the English translation. Alexamenos worships his God. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most established facts in human history. It is more certain than any fact in antiquity. Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus died on a cross. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your word. Oh, how powerful it is.